Okay, good evening everyone. My name is Elena Crippa. I'm curator of contemporary art here at the Courtauld. Welcome everyone, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Rachel Jones here tonight with us for an in-conversation ahead of our commission at the Courtauld.
Yes.
I will begin by giving you a very brief introduction about Rachel, and then we have a series of slides.
Yeah.
And these will last something between 40 minutes and an hour,
Yes.
assume, and then we will open to questions, so please do ask anything. So very briefly, I will not go through your entire exhibition history because it's quite extraordinary, but Rachel Jones was born in and lives in London, and she studied fine art at the Glasgow School of Art and the Royal Academy Schools, graduating in 2019.
Yeah.
Quite extraordinary time.
Yes, I know.
Before COVID. And her solo exhibitions include Chisel Gallery in 2022 in London, your first institutional show here, the Long Museum in Shanghai in 2023, the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco in 2024, and very recently your exhibition, Gated Canyons, has opened at Dulwich Picture Gallery, so please do go and see it. It's open until the 19th of October.
Yes.
And two new very exciting works are in the making.
Yes.
And will be unveiled at the Courtauld Gallery on the 25th of September. And they will literally will transform the entrance hall and ticketing hall in the gallery, and the way in which you approach the gallery. Suddenly we'll have this extraordinary new presence. And for tonight, when we started discussing what to do, we felt that maybe as you're actually taking a year off soon,
Yes.
to dedicate time to yourself.
Yes.
This was a good opportunity to look forward the commission, but also look a little bit back and
Yes.
think about the sort of journey you've made
Yes.
towards
Yes.
these works.
Yeah.
So I haven't practiced with this, but we have
Very good.
yes,
Yes.
here we are.
Yes.
On your studio. And maybe we can start talking. So this is very much a sort of constant presence in the center of your studio,
Yes.
filled with your materials.
Yeah.
I was wanting to start thinking about your journey of electing pastel and stick oils
Yeah.
as your mediums.
Yeah.
And maybe we could also look in the meantime at, I need to point here,
Yeah.
these works, which is probably the first one you encounter in the second room of your exhibition in Dulwich, and it's tiny, it's this size, from 2021.
Yeah. I suppose this is a good example of the way that I work when I'm thinking about the materiality of pastels and oil sticks and how that varies across the scale of the work. And if I'm working on something small, the amount of material that ends up landing on the surface tends to be a lot more loaded. There's this scratching that sometimes happens where I remove material, and the drawn line, it has more weight to it in a certain way, I think, because the pastels you can see on the table, they're quite large, and so the idea of doing anything fine becomes really difficult. So there's a certain weight or intensity to the mark making that happens when the works are on a smaller scale. And I ended up, I suppose, working most of the time with pastels and oil sticks because it was very connected to my time drawing while I was actually not even at the Royal Academy. Before I went there, I was doing life drawing still when I had a studio, and I started to bring in oil pastels so I could draw with colour, because I kept on thinking about, well, what is the relationship to the body and my relationship to colour? And the way I started to, I suppose, like, work out what that might be was through drawing with pastels in life drawing sessions, and abstracting certain parts of the body. So I had this sketchbook that I worked in, and I think that prompted a relationship to oil pastels specifically, but also thinking about how colour functions in my understanding of, I suppose, drawing and painting. Because a lot of life drawing is obviously done with charcoal or like one tone, and so the relationship between drawing and painting started to merge a little bit for me because of my history of doing life drawing at Glasgow and then after as well. So yeah, it's kind of always a subtle part of my painting practice, and I think the size of these things speak a little bit more to drawing as well for some reason. So yeah, there's lots of different things that I'm interested in when I make these works.
You definitely have this sense that you're looking in, rather than the much more gestural.
Yes, exactly.
Work.
Yeah, they feel a bit more intimate, and yeah, I suppose the ratio of your body in comparison to the work, it feels like you're being met by it in a different way. So I feel like that's an important thing to engage with, especially because this is mounted on aluminium, so it can hang off the wall. But often I staple these paintings to the wall, and ideas around how we present painting, or the context around how we frame works to protect them or to make them feel a little bit more finished or complete. I'm very interested in problematizing some of those, I suppose, established rules about what ways we should hang paintings and the need to protect them and care for them for many years to come. Like, these are very vulnerable, like oil pastels, I don't fix them, so they respond to the environment, and some material always gets removed if people touch them or like move them around. So all of that stuff is part of the work as well, and so I suppose there's this tension that's always present in some way.
Yeah. And you're speaking about drawing particularly being something that you sort of carry through as your first love in a way.
Yeah.
Part of your practice.
Yes. Yeah. It's what I did when I was a child. Like, it was a lot of self-exploration through drawing, and also I think quite a lot of like my confidence was built through understanding how to draw and how to look at things and how to interpret things in my own way. Like, it takes a very long time to understand how to do that, but it's very empowering when you're able to develop your own visual language, and that does come from spending a lot of time looking and responding to things, and I did that through drawing.
And would you say that there is also a relationship between your student work of using pastel to represent bodies to this presence of the body in a very different, maybe more subliminal or allegorical way?
Yeah, I think most of the works that I make now are a lot more generous in a way because there's more figuration in them. So the works I was making at school were a lot more abstract. And I think that's in part because I was still learning how to make the sort of imagery that I was interested in. It's a lot like unearthing things that are hidden or unknown and trying to figure out how to manifest them through, I suppose, like quite a performative act of just applying colour to surface and then using a symbol as a way to structure some of the thinking. So repeating teeth or a tooth or a mouth, that was a way to try and access things that were very inaccessible to me, but felt like I needed to like externalize them. And so that is also happening materially and formally, like thinking about how do you make an image, how do you create a composition around one body part, and how do you create a landscape as well at the same time, because I think that's also what I was trying to do. And so there are very practical problems that I wanted to solve, but also very emotional, like spiritual ones about my relationship to myself and the world, and then also how painting is part of that. And I find it really difficult to make paintings, but it was always something that I kept on returning to. And so there was always this very intense, I suppose, wrestling that I felt like I was experiencing when I started to make this work. And I think that tension has now shifted a little bit because I understand how I produce a painting. I understand my visual language. And so there are other things that I'm now able to explore. It's like I have a language to use as a basis and a foundation. And now I can maybe go beyond that.
Yeah. And we will talk much more about the language as we go through the talk. And we have some specific images of some of the language references you're using.
Yes.
But the next, next slide, we want to go big.
Yes.
And sort of really speak about this extraordinary transition of how you're able to work on this very tiny looking in the walls that you conduct the drawing to the extraordinary works, and I think everyone went to the Hayward to the Mixing Art Show in the autumn of 21. Remember encountering this work which is just over 7 meters wide. So maybe I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about moving to that scale and working on these increasingly ambitious, monumental.
I suppose I always find it easier to make large paintings than small ones. So this actually wasn't as difficult to make as the painting that we saw before. And I used to avoid making small paintings at all costs because I found it too difficult to work in such a confined space. Like, something that's really enjoyable about the way I paint is that there's a large amount of energy emitted through the process of painting, and the way I paint requires using my whole body. Like this work, for example, everything that's unstretched gets made on the wall exactly as it's shown. So I just cut canvas and then staple it to the wall. And so my entire body is used to make the work, and this idea of my arm being used to make a gesture, not just my hand. And the smaller works are made at a table, and I'm sat down and I look down, and sometimes I stand up and look down. And it's like this confinement of the wrist as opposed to the breadth of movement that I get with my arm. I feel like that is something that is different between the different sizes of painting and how I work. And so there's something, I suppose, within my nature where I don't like to stay in positions of like comfort for too long in terms of when I'm working. Like, I think if something is relatively easy for me to do, then it's very important to go beyond that and to challenge myself. And so making a large work was something that I'd always wanted to do. I always work on a large scale. Like, the bigger the better, basically. It was sort of my mentality. So this was actually something that I was really excited to do, because my studio isn't big enough to make something like this, but I got to work in a bigger space because it was during COVID, and my studio building let me work in a room where I could make something this scale. And so it was really fun. Like, it felt like an opportunity to work in a way that I'd always wanted to work. And the paintings that I make at the moment are split over 2 canvases. They're that size because they're the biggest I can make in my studio. So working on a large scale is actually much more normal for me than working on a smaller scale.
And I think talking about the sort of very broadly physically engaged performativity of the work links quite well to a project you did just before this work was shown at the Hayward, which was the Blessing upon Blessing. At Alsden High Street. And I was just looking at the dates. We came out of the second lockdown on the 23rd of June 2021. So I was just thinking, this also feels very much like a coming out.
Yes, it was. I suppose like the difference I felt in making work when I was by myself in the studio painting to what it was like to be around other artists when I was studying and just being part of more of a community. Like, I wanted to think about how to bring an element of that into my way of working. And I love music, and my relationship to music was something I never really engaged with that much in an artistic sense before I went to school. But when I was at the RA, I started to make sound collages, and I experimented with recording things. And so I felt like this was the extension of that, but doing it, like you said, in a moment where people hadn't been together for a long time. Black Lives Matter and George Floyd was very prescient, and I think the sense of weariness and tiredness was very much felt by myself and I think my community. So I wanted to do something where there could be a collective moment for us to be together, and there was an emphasis on the Black experience, but it being one of joy, and also celebrating like our contributions to culture and thinking about music as being the most obvious one for most people. And so we had a pro-Black karaoke where you could only sing songs if you...
just see you sing.
Yes, this is me and my sister. You could only sing songs if you were Black or identified as Black, and you could only sing songs by a Black artist. And I decorated the space with images from memes, there are pictures of my friends, artists, work that I like, Black intellectuals, family, and then things from nature. And I got friends to record themselves singing, and I made a playlist of songs so that when people weren't performing, there was always music in the space. And then the entire evening was recorded, the sound was captured, and then once the night was over, the sound of the evening was played on a loop in the space, so that when you went in, you could hear the remnants of the night with all of the balloons like slowly deflating and the lights and the pictures still up. And it was my first time doing anything slightly collaborative, because I was performing with people and people contributing recordings of themselves, and it gave me a taste of what it's like to, I suppose, set the foreground for an emotional experience, and then to try to connect to people who are both known to me and unknown, to bring them into that space. So yeah, it was an amazing thing for me to do as well, because I was very nervous about the fact that I'd only worked with painting and I didn't know what the experience would be like, trying to, I suppose, emphasize my relationship critically to music, not just in terms of an emotional one. And I'd never performed before either, so I didn't know what it was going to be like, but it was great, so I'm happy I did it.
And what was great about it was?
I found out that I have an incredible amount of stamina for performance if it involves using a microphone as like a way to project my voice. I don't really know what that means, but there's something I don't know what, it's quite intriguing. Something that happens to me maybe in terms of my ability to extend my persona beyond what I ordinarily would in like a day-to-day setting. Like, I don't like being a centre of attention. I like one-to-one interactions. I don't like being parts of groups that much. But then like having a microphone, it suddenly changed the context for what it means to be in the presence of other people. And I suddenly realised that I found it very easy to perform, and I was very happy for people to look at me, and actually I found a lot of power being in that position. And so yeah, I think it revealed parts of myself to myself that I didn't realise were there.
Yeah. And there is something interesting how you describe this reaching out of your movements of the making of your work. It sort of seems to be quite in sync to me with the way you describe performing and projecting and describing yourself. And maybe it's just very interesting in relation to this project, and primarily in terms of the images you used rather than the sound. We were thinking about the Chisenel Gallery, not just the exhibition, which we can return to, but more specifically the book that you made. And I'm really sorry, I forgot to bring my copy, but if you haven't seen it, just go and get it, because it's just an extraordinary book. It feels that the book itself was a project as much as the exhibition. And in the book you have a section which effectively you organize by using pages of different colors. And in each having an image. So these are just snapshots that I took from the book. And I don't know if you want to describe just the project and the range of images. We had a lot of contributions from writers, which was incredible. Like a breadth of people wrote a response to the work, and some of it was more poetic, whilst other pieces of writing were academic. And then I had a conversation with Claudia Rankin, and I felt like there was a lot of text, and I didn't really make a huge amount of paintings for the Chisholm House show, so I was like, there's a disparity in the visual content and the written word, and so I wanted to give something to people where they could understand a sense of what my relationship to the work was outside of the paintings. And also I have this thing where I think visual art is quite inaccessible to a lot of people in terms of what they feel they need to know or understand in order to comment or feel like they can connect to something. And I was like, well, if the book is full of colour and pictures, then there's this immediate conversation that you're having with something, even if they don't want to read all the texts that are there. And a context is provided for the paintings. It might not make sense, but it's definitely present. And so I gathered things that are reflective of the sort of
I suppose, things I engage with in my day to day. So there's images of flowers, potatoes from my mum's garden that we grew. I teach, and so this is a painting by a child, and then we Photoshop my face into the mouth, so I'm being eaten by the shark. There's some paintings by artists that I've looked at since my time at Glasgow. Images of plants, George Washington's teeth. This is a batik of the Tree of Life. So things that are kind of obscure in a sense because they're not listed, like none of these images are labelled for anyone, but there's something that you can perceive about them or maybe understand, and like there's a theme or a pattern of certain things coming up again and again in what I'm looking at. And so it felt like a nice way to be a little bit more open, but also to emphasize the fact that I look at all sorts of things, and although the paintings are often quite abstract in their form, they are rooted in things that are very personal and specific, and I suppose relatable to more people than you would imagine.
Yeah, and in particular, I mean, we can mention is Georgia Khan at the time, which was very much inspired by Japanese printmaking at the same time as Gauguin, and then this incredible Carrie James Marshall from 1980, a portrait of the artist, the shadow of his former self, and this early Elena from 2003 first. And what I find really striking is this really, this sort of combination of these really powerful artist works alongside images of flowers or other objects, found images, and now you brought them together. Is this how you work? Do you create banks of images that you return to?
Yeah, I have lots of folders in my phone of things that I capture, and sometimes it's because they're funny or they really get to the center of some sort of truth that I find relevant for me. Or it could just be like they're very aesthetically pleasing, maybe the color palette or composition is really interesting, or I find them like humorous and scary at the same time. And I thought I'm really interested in humor and threat and how those two things are interwoven, often very closely to each other. And that's very prevalent in cartoons, which I've spoken about being a very important reference point for the series of things I made for Dulwich, and also for this commission and the past year, and understanding how my relationship to quite intense emotions, whether they be fear, anger, desire, joy, like they were contextualized for me in cartoons, and I understood my relationship to maybe quite difficult things via watching what happened in cartoons and the landscape of them, both emotionally and also pictorially. So
is this interest in what affected you both emotionally and as an artist? And this looking back at this child is something quite recent?
Yeah, it's only happened maybe in the past year and a half, because I don't normally have reference images when I'm working. Like most of the paintings will really just be entirely made up, or maybe I did make a series of works for about a year of my friend's tooth, but at a certain point I stopped looking at the picture and I was just drawing it from memory. So it's very different to have an incredible history of cartoons to look at, because I suppose I'm re-engaging with a part of my life that I hadn't really thought about being particularly relevant to how I make, but actually it was the entire infrastructure of how I understand colour, abstraction and sound, like the classical music that was used to score Disney films or all of the cartoons that were coming out of MGM Studios, and then stuff that I would see later on in like Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon. Like my relationship to like colour and sound was really based on me watching cartoons and reading comics as well, and thinking about lines, the importance of lines and separation of colour by line, and the idea of like boundaries and things being extended or shrinking or being flattened, or the weight of a line, or like all of that sort of stuff, I think unconsciously registered. And I wanted to know what would happen if I was directly looking at that as source material when I started to paint, because I hadn't done that before. Yeah.
Second journey.
Yes.
So we'll see more as we go forward. I would like to ask you something maybe slightly more broad about the relationship with language, with racial identity. The art historian Courtauld has written and in a very insightful and influential way about the burden of representation for Black artists, which is this burden in a very concise way to represent Black people more broadly.
Yeah.
But I think there is another burden that is put on artists who happen to be Black, which is an expectation that is not put on white artists, that they should address their work in relation to their racial identity.
Yeah.
And my perception is that the way you have spoken about yourself, your identity, your racial identity, about your work has slightly changed over time.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, again, I'm perfectly aware that at this point I'm putting the same burden on you. Anyway. But because lots of the conversations here about, your blessing project and some of the reference images, I just wonder if you want to talk to us about this burden, how you have dealt with it, and maybe changed your approach about you.
Yeah, I think it's like there's always the desire for me to center my experience in whatever I make, and so that means in some ways there is a very explicit intention that is expressed in the work, and I articulate that as well when I speak about things. For the Chisenhell show, for example, we don't have a picture of it, but I had a huge sticker on the grate to close the gallery outside. And it had a picture of a rapper, but from the back, and he had his hands up, and there were some agapanthus flowers in the distance. And it's the same sort of image I would have from the book. And it had a caption on Instagram of healthy, non-coronavirus having African American man. And I always have the desire to express what it means to feel what it means to feel like I am both very present in the world and very invisible at the same time, and the difficulty of that, but fundamentally how I can circumvent some of the cages that I feel like I'm trapped in because of it. And at times it means being really direct and pointed about what I'm doing, like the karaoke. I was like, I always speak about it as being, it's a pro-Black karaoke. And then other times I'm more coded, and things are always contextualized through the Black experience, but maybe not everybody will understand that. And that can happen in language through titling things like, I think the Hayward painting, that's part of the Lick Your Teeth, They So Clutch series, and thinking about the informality of everything being lowercase in language and how colloquialisms are used in Black culture or amongst certain Black people. Like, some of these things are used as a way to kind of puncture the idea of the work, and it not only being something that people can look at from a lens of like a formal position or only want to talk about it intellectually. Like, there is a political and social element to the work, but it isn't always on the nose. And I do think that means that it's either missed in certain ways, or people will latch on to the Black part of the work in a way where they don't see anything else. And so I suppose like part of my journey as an artist is just responding to where I am in each moment and thinking about how I can honour myself and the people I want to connect to most, which is other people of colour, and speaking to them whilst also making space for other people to be part of that conversation. And in a lot of the things that I do, there's this sense of, if you know, you know, like the pictures in, like these pictures, not everyone will know who these artists are, or the idea of what the context might mean of all of these things being put together. But some people will, or some people might understand parts of it. And so I'm talking to everyone always, but in a way, questioning like the idea of positionality and what you can connect to, what you can understand about something is based on who you are, what you're willing to understand about someone else, about yourself, and the idea that there are always limitations within ourselves and between people. But if you can establish a sense of reciprocity, and invite people to feel like they have permission to ask questions of themselves and others, then you get somewhere in destabilizing these very entrenched ideas we have about how we should respond to things, how we behave, the responsibilities Black people might have versus white people, and like all of this sort of stuff. And so I never want to give someone the excuse that they felt like they weren't able to say something. I try to make it as simple as possible for people to be able to respond to the work, and what they respond to is kind of down to what they care about and who they are, because I feel like what I care about is actually very present in the work, but it might not be as easy to get in one grasp. Yeah.
You know, it's fascinating how you're discussing it, because I feel you have taken this burden of, you know, engaging with this discourse in this very sophisticated way, where you are sort of acknowledging this is a very important part of how my, you know, life has been in a way shaped who I am, but also pushing conversations about your work, or inviting conversations about your work in different directions that opens it up and doesn't reduce it.
Yeah, exactly.
To that. So, but I also feel it's a lot of work on the part of an artist to balance.
It can be. I think it's one of those things where I realised quickly that if I didn't assert that the work is about Black interiority and what my relationship to that is, then no one was going to consider that as something to contextualize the practice within. And so I was very committed to articulating that position that I had. And now I feel like it's been established in the different ways that I work, in terms of the karaoke and the opera and the visual context I provide for people in the books, and like the way I speak about the work when I talk about it. It's not that I want to tell people what to see or what to understand, but I'm expressing what my concerns are. And I realised that if I didn't do that, then things were going to be presented in a way where there's a huge lack of understanding about why I'm making what I'm making, and then the legacy of people who have also been doing that for many, many decades as well. Like, I'm part of that history, and I'm just trying to engage with it in a way that feels, I suppose, like relevant to me, and I want to speak to that history, and that's why I talk so much about the literature that I read, and why I talk so much about the things I find online and cartoons and like all of these. I feel like people often want things to be linear and flat and singular, and that's not how life is. And I want to complicate things because people are complicated, talking about race is complicated, painting is complicated, and I want all of these things to feel present and like they're engaging with each other. They're not excluded at any point.
And we will be exploring a few more of these sides. What's next?
Yes.
So I want to include this picture particularly because it was included in an exhibition created by a colleague of ours that they call Courtauld Indicaduri, and it was exhibited in Venice last year in an exhibition titled In Praise of Black Errantry. And I think what was really, for me, was extraordinary when I saw this work is the sort of difference that I felt in the way these mouth become much more solid and present.
A lot more literal. I think this was part of this series of paintings I made for the Museum of African Diaspora, and it was the first body.
How do you read the title, by the way?
It's you say you see the title,
you see the
but
title.
then if you have to say it, it's just 5 exclamation points. That was part of the series of paintings I made where I looked at cartoons for the first time, and I actually looked at the cartoons that Cynthia Bokwe, she did a visual and written response to my work by creating this maybe 10-page spread of like reference images and like collages of what she sees both in history, music, politics, science, and art in my work. And she had cartoons as part of that. And so I used what she had drawn on to make that next series of work. And she did that for the catalogue for the Shanghai show. So there's always this trajectory from each body of work where they're always speaking to each other and one thing prompts another. And so these paintings were a lot more literal in describing mouths, because I wanted to think about how I could use like abstract languages in part to speak to things that were made very literal and always emphasized in this exaggerated and extreme way. And so the size of the mouth was always very large, slightly monstrous in a way, and lived in a landscape. Like that's the first time I thought about the mouths not being in like a color landscape or thinking about an interior landscape as just color and pattern. And there was this lack of, I suppose, like maybe fluidity in terms of how the mouth or teeth engage with the landscape. There were like very defined boundaries, like the mouth was sitting on the ground and then there was a sky, and it took up that entire space and it became a body of sorts. And it had a personality and agency. So it's the first time I did any of that.
And we have another example here, which is also a moment where, and we can maybe also show the other slides. This is a beautiful installation show from the Museum of Diaspora, where actually you start from a traditional point of view, going back to a more traditional way of stretching your canvases.
And also working on linen. This is the first time I worked on linen, and it really changed the way I thought about colour and how I applied colour. Like these paintings and the ones I've been making for the past year, they're a lot less layered. Colours sit next to each other a lot more, which is what happens in cartoons. There are these lines that define the shapes really clearly. And there's still like my visual, I suppose, language in terms of the technique I use to paint. So like the linear mark making that is really, I suppose, prevalent in how I work. That's a part of all of these paintings, and the way I try to use like combative whilst also complementary color combinations, like that's all very much part of it. But there is a simplicity to it, I would say, and me trying to reduce the amount of information and material, and also doing that by letting parts of the linen breathe. And sometimes in like some examples, like huge parts of the linen are left. And so there is this exploration of the material and my sense of like how to work within like a different maybe space in terms of what I want the colours to do and what I want them to feel like, because these works are just as energetic, but there's less information in them. So I was like, how do you still accomplish the same kind of frenetic, chaotic energy whilst applying as little material as possible? So I think there was more of like a formal shift in how I made them, what I wanted to accomplish, and then also what source material I was using and how that was changing things for me.
Would you say that here you start, we talked a little bit in the studio about the structure and how important structure is to your work and the sense of verticality, horizontality, and how much that plays with it against a more sort of way of improvising or working a more intuitive way. Do you think this is a series where you've been pushing it further?
Yeah, I think I changed the structure when I started to work on linen, because before there was always a coloured ground that I would start with. So I wasn't ever responding to just the colour of the cotton. There was colour immediately, and then I would reply to whatever colour was on the surface. And so a conversation started from me making one choice, where I then had to make another one, and I go back and forth deciding what colours and like how I want the work to materialise. It's very instinctual, and you sort of get into a rhythm. Whereas with this work, because I knew that I loved the colour of, when I got the canvases to the studio, I was like, oh, the linen is gorgeous. And you can see the weave, and it's all sized with rabbit skin glue. And this is what happened at Dulwich as well. When the light hits it, it sort of glitters. So there is this sense of me really wanting to celebrate the materiality of the linen and not completely obscuring that. So I was like, oh, well, if you want to leave the linen, it means that you can't just really make everything up without some way of knowing what you're doing. So I would draw the mouth out immediately, and then from that I would start doing the back and forth of like putting colour down, responding to that, but at the same time responding to the colour of the linen always, and being like, how much of you can I leave, how much needs to be left, and as I went along from painting to painting, I got more and more confident. And the very last painting is the one which has the least amount on it, which is that one. And the painting you showed before, that was the very first painting I made. So it's kind of like going from like this to this one to the one at the end of the exhibition on the back wall. There's a huge, I suppose, sense of me starting to understand how to use the space.
Sorry, I've jumped twice now by mistake.
There we go.
You were right here.
That one. Think about how to use the space and like the color palette shifting. Like there are a lot of dark tones in these paintings, which I don't normally use so much. And I suppose thinking about the visual language changing by adding certain things like trees and grass, and the idea of like a sky and ground is in every single painting, even if it's just a line, and then bricks as well. That was something I started to paint. So thinking about a landscape, and also a landscape that is from the world that I inhabit, not just the one that I feel and experience psychologically, emotionally.
And maybe we'll go quickly through the next two slides, because we said along, but this is one of the works in Dulwich, which has this great area of bare canvas. And also, I was wondering if you could say something about this split canvas and how you work across. Never continuous.
So the studio I work in is too small for me to make anything larger than basically canvases this size, and the only way I can work on something this scale was to make it over 2 canvases, because then they can get out the door and down the stairs. So when I started to think about how to make the paintings, I didn't want to ignore the line in the middle, because it's something that I felt could potentially provide a way for me to think more about how to produce an interesting image, and the relationship between how we see things as both separate entities and a whole, and the idea of how you use colour to balance out what's happening in a painting, or to emphasise the discordant nature of a painting. I felt like that was an opportunity for me to do some of those things, and so in a way the split to me becomes more invisible, because I don't try to pretend that it's not there, and the colours never engage with each other in a way where they continue across the divide, and there's always a difference in what is happening on each side. And I feel like for some reason it creates this cohesive whole, where all of the things that are kind of discordant anyway in the painting are emphasised by the split, and so it kind of makes sense. It's like a wonky sort of maths or something. And
the next one, this is effectively the last word of the exhibition, which becomes truly, when you still have this mouth, it very much becomes much more like a landscape.
Exactly. And the thing about like the studio being really small, like it's not tall enough for me to make the works vertically, so I make them landscape. So there's this funny thing again where the limitations of the studio change the way I can make the work. So they get made horizontally, and I have to turn my head to draw them and to see what I'm doing, and then I take pictures and rotate the painting so I can see what's happening, but I don't ever get to see them the correct way up until they're hung. And so there's always this like tension and element of surprise for me, where I'm like, I don't really know what the work looks like, but I think that is also part of the process anyway. Like I don't really understand or know what I'm doing, but I also feel like that is part of maybe like the mystery of making anything, where like your job isn't to question what's happening, but it is to be critically engaged with the decisions that you're making. And then after, you can take a step back and actually look at it. And so I suppose I feel like the part of me that guides the process of me making this is not the same part of me that is talking about them now. Like, they're connected, but like they're different parts of my brain and I suppose like spirit. And I think there's always this excitement for me when the works are revealed, or like they open up to me through conversations like this, or when people go and see the shows and they tell me things, or when I spend time with them and I start to understand them better. Because also I go through this phase where every painting I make I dislike, and it's because I don't understand them. Like, so they're confusing, and often things that you don't understand are threatening or uncomfortable, and it's like I can't really see them properly, even though I made them. So yeah, there's this important gestation period where things have to settle, and yeah, like part of that is, I think, because of the way I have to make them, the difficulty I have in making things a certain size, the things that I have to engage with a divide. Like, there's all these challenges that mean, it's not like, it's not a particularly simple process to make. And everything's made up, so I never know what a paint's going to look like. And there's always a risk, like I could potentially make something really awful. That's always a risk, but yeah.
What was very exciting for us, particularly from the Courtauld, when we arrived to this painting, and that we could really feel that relationship with that Impressionist, Post-Impressionist particular group of artists. And this is, of course, something we have spoken also quite a bit as we invited you, but also you have spoken yourself. And particularly last year when Crippa invited you to do a piece, choosing your favorite piece in the London collection, you chose the Vincent van Gogh self-portrait in the
This is the OG painter of all time to me. This is why I thought I could be an artist. We did a painting of one of his sunflowers in primary school, and it was after that I'd been drawing or whatever, but it was after that I was like, oh, like people make art, and then you learn about people who make art even after they're dead, and my mind was blown, and I was like, I want to be an artist like him. But I was just like, oh, but he's a man, and also he's white, so I probably can't be an artist. But it's the first time I understood that that was a job, or that people did that and like were really serious about it. Because it's really weird when you're good at something but you don't understand, like, you can build a life around it, like, because drawing was very personal and it was like just for me, and so I started to understand that it had meaning and value beyond what it meant to me. So it was really important to me.
And what was in his work particularly that you felt in that?
I just think like he's the most phenomenal colorist, and he works with lines as well. I just realised that. Yeah, he works with, well, I knew that, but he works with lines, and the idea of like how he uses the line to describe an object, a piece of clothing, a face, a landscape. It's just really phenomenal. Like, it's both expressive and descriptive. It's imaginative and real. I don't know. I just feel like it's everything you could ever want something to have in a painting. And there's just this sensitivity, and like I feel like my work has this energy that's in it, which is very much about the physicality of it. And I think that all of his paintings has this energy, but it's a very different one. It's like I don't know, a very emotional and psychological energy that you feel just through color, and it's like that's what I'm fascinated by, and that's what I want to try and do with my paintings. There's like this nuance to the work, even though it appears to be incredibly simple. I just think there's so much complexity in the painting, in all of them. And he's just like genuinely incredible at using color.
And there's something also what you describe as hurting. Hurting.
There's just I think an overwhelming amount to learn from looking at his paintings, and thinking again about cartoons, like this idea of like how a line is used to outline or border, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is what you see not only in his work, but also Gauguin, and I'm like, like, and comics. I'm like, it's all kind of, like a funny way to think about the formative years I had of thinking about art. It was like this and cartoons.
Yeah, and when we were discussing which pictures to select, you were looking at the guides from the National Gallery show, and it's quite visual because Van Gogh describes this painting in a letter to his brother pretty much exclusively by color, by discussing the sort of looking at the landscape and looking at these yellows and oranges and turquoise and sort of, dots of lilacs.
Yes, and I think also there's something about how, like, the direction of movement in the paintings, like there's like a way that you're guided to look at what's happening because of the direction. And even in his drawings, they're stunning. Like the way he uses lines, like it's like they have density, and they have like a physical form. Like it's not just something like linear. I don't know, it's really weird. They're great.
And it's also interesting when he describes this painting, he writes this by saying it was pure hokusai, seeing that landscape, and so I wanted to represent it, and the connection with Japanese painting is also very much powerful. And the other artist that you suggested, let's have images of, you have already named, is Gauguin. And you said particularly you saw an exhibition at the Courtauld, which was quite a while back.
It was,
2013, which was very important to you.
Yes. I think, like, I know obviously like these two artists had a relationship, but I think there's something about, the way they paint landscapes and thinking about, like, the colours that are used to describe either like spaces or the emotional lives of the people that are in those spaces, and how yellow is really important, and then dark colours, but never really black, like purple, blues, greens, how they have this weight to them, and how they ground things, but also puncture maybe some of the, like, domesticity or like ordinariness of things. Like there's like this gravitational pull that happens when like blues are used, like to bring in light but also weigh down like what is happening maybe in a scene. And I just think like that sort of stuff, when I was looking at it, I was probably in my early 20s, I just found it really moving, but also I suppose intriguing, and was always thinking like, how do I do that? I was always like, oh, this is good, but like I don't know how I do that. And so I was always looking at stuff to try and figure out what it meant for me and how I could then do the same thing. I think that's why I was so fascinated with the two of them specifically, because they had such a distinct way of using colour and creating compositions in terms of how things happen in space. There's like this like flattening and obscure like relationship between things in a space, like dimensionally. I was just like so like enthralled by it, and but I also felt like I didn't have an access to that in my own way of making. So
and we have another slide just of other works that was in that exhibition.
Yum.
And finally, we are coming to some very minor references to our commission. So I'm just showing to you the two spaces where the two commission works will be installed in the entrance hall and in the ticketing hall instead of those boards. And we have an image, for now just two small details of the first work, the portrait. So it's you can't quite see the full image yet, which is coming. It's nearly completed.
This one is done.
And it's a very explosive sort of energy, and also has a lot of green.
It has loads of green and turquoise. Yes, and orange. So I always settle on reds and yellows as my sweet spot, and I think in the past year I've been trying to move outside of that. And so with this work, I really kind of went in a direction I wasn't expecting to, where I started to use green. I find it really difficult to use green and orange and purple and blues together, and also browns as well. So this painting really has a lot of that. And it meant it was incredibly difficult to make. I really wrestled with it. But I think like after spending quite a long time making it, I've been painting for a year now, basically. I wanted this commission to, like, I suppose, be like the final, like, full stop for a whole year of like developing a better relationship to thinking about colour and space whilst working on linen, and like the more figurative element of mouths and teeth being like an integral part of my painting practice for the past year. I wanted that to be pushed as far as possible. So this painting is probably more abstract than maybe some of the ones I've made recently, as is the other one. And the colour palette is also a lot more intense and it's a lot different to what I've ever really done before, I think, in certain ways. And the shapes that are in these two paintings as well are different, and kind of following on from the forms that I've started to make in like the Dulwich series as well. So yeah, they're responding to the work of the past year and trying to like go as far as possible from that.
And this sense of really exciting energy cascading through these details, I think we can show the image.
Yes, yeah,
that
yeah.
inspired one detail of the painting, but I think maybe also the energy.
Yeah,
of
it is.
the style.
Yeah, yes,
yeah, it is.
Yes. So this is like the sort of thing that I would look at when thinking about how to start a painting. Like I would find a shape or a mouth or something that I'm like, oh, I want to use that as the foundation for the work. And here it was Tom's mouth, and because that space is quite awkward, it's like long, it's tall and narrow, and that's not a size I like. So I was like, I have to think about where the mouth will be located, because it's not going to be a landscape in terms of, you know, like I suppose like a landscape painting because of the orientation. So I decided to think about the mouth operating in this central way and like what impact it has on the space. And so the definition of the, I suppose, the activity or like the chaos around the mouth, like that really became what the painting was about.
Yeah. I think this image and the painting itself was encapsulate a lot of what you were describing as this tension between something which has sort of comedic or as humor, but also there is this sense of discomfort.
Or violence, or like something like, I suppose, overwhelming happening, and then like the difficulty in containing or processing that, and the, I suppose, dysregulation that comes with that. Yes, I think some of that is in these works. Yeah.
And when we were discussing this work in the studio, which has this extraordinary intensity, you also said there might be something different here because, in a way, I had much more time to work on these pictures, and there is a sort of different rhythm of in and out.
Yeah, I took longer to make these, and I feel like it just meant that there was more opportunity for me to understand what was happening whilst I was struggling to make the work. Like, I had an idea of what I thought the painting would look like, and then it didn't end up being anything like that. And then that was very difficult for me to deal with, because I kept on trying to see if it needed to be guided back to the way I thought it should be, or if I should just see what would happen if I allowed myself to go in a direction that I didn't fully understand. And I ended up doing that, but it meant I needed to sit with the painting a lot longer. I wasn't just constantly working on it, I was looking at it for quite long periods of time, only doing little bits every now and then. But weirdly, like, I was sort of like obsessed with it, because every time I did something I was like, oh, it's better, and I'd see it the next day, I was like, oh, it's not, and so I would do more. And so there was this very slow layering that was able to happen because I didn't have to kind of meet any sort of deadline for it to be done. And so maybe that's also why I unconsciously made it as like difficult as possible by because I don't know why I used green, but as soon as you put green in a painting, it's sort of like it sings in this way where your eye immediately goes to it, and so I was like, oh, I have to balance this out now, but you know, like to balance out green is very challenging, and so I ended up putting more green, and then I was like, oh, but what, you don't want a green painting though, so like how do you bring other colours in around it so that it's not a green painting, which it isn't, I don't think.
It is not.
No, yeah,
not.
so.
And then we also have details of the second painting, which is extraordinarily different.
Yes.
This to me was the greatest surprise.
Yes.
I somehow expected the two to be a dialogue, while they feel quite different journeys.
Yeah, they are. I think partly because of the scale, and
they're much larger.
Yeah, this one is larger, and it's a landscape painting. And yeah, it's, I suppose, trying to do what I started to do in some of the work that I made recently for a show in LA, where I was thinking about the impact of a body in space. So I was only painting movement. And I wanted to think about that because there was a lot of movement in the other painting, but it's much more explosive and it's centered on a mouth. Whereas this was different because I just wanted there to be a sense of something has happened and we don't know what it is or why, but there is just this aftermath of movement. And I was like, that in and of itself, like the idea of trying to describe movement visually is an incredibly abstract concept. So I was like, oh, this is something that I wanted to play with. And to do that in a much more structured setting where there is a landscape for that to kind of take place in. So the color palette is different, and there's an intensity, but it's not the same as the one for like the smaller work. Yeah.
I feel also in the images you collect and gather movement and this sense of inner energy of growth, of development. There's always something, there's a flower opening or someone dancing or moving.
There's something maybe quite sometimes I have really fascinating conversations with people and they bring up things to do with like physics and biology, like the idea of like time and like cells and things like that, and the paintings reminding them of like spaces in time. Like if time was physical and you cut into it, it's like maybe part of the painting is what you like, this idea of color and space and like collisions and things like that, but also dimensionally things being flat and also having depth. I feel like some of that maybe happens in the work, and this is kind of like part of that, but but the reference material is so literal and like I suppose kind of exaggerated because it's in the context of a cartoon, that I have approached it differently.
And maybe you can see more in the first work, but actually the way you combine darker colors and lighter tones creates a really extraordinary sense of depth.
Yeah,
I think it's very special to what you are looking at here. Shall we show the reference image of the second one?
For the second one.
Is it coming? Not sure, I'm not very good at clicking. Let's try again. Or maybe there is a delay, and now we're going to go to the very end. Ahead. You're doing all fantastic. Thank you. So you might just see the relationship between the image on the left and this wonderful movie. I mean, it's a fantastic image.
Yeah, I feel like all cartoons are fantastic. When you just get like a still, you're like, whoa, it's so great. But I think just like the colors, like people who made cartoons, I suppose in the 40s, 50s, like has such a good understanding of color and movement. Like it's amazing. Yeah, so I feel really lucky that I grew up in the era of being able to watch those things and that just being what was on telly. Yeah.
We want to open to the audience very soon, but maybe just one last slide and really point to our conversation, and I went one too far, okay, which as at the same time as developing these pictures for really the past 3 years, you've also been working consistently on a project that involves music and sound and a sort of operatic project.
Yes.
Which in a way starts around a year before you perform first in September 23. Hey Moody at St. James in Piccadilly, which was initially commissioned by the Roberts Institute, and then you also staged it again as a sort of rehearsal project in an open session as the Monting in November last year, and you've just done a session in Berlin. Do you want to tell us something about this project, which is ongoing and we don't quite know yet?
Yes,
it's going to end.
Yeah. So as it is, we have I suppose like 35-minute operatic work, and it's based on a character from a book called Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks. And at the time where I was approached to do the commission, I was very tired and overwhelmed. And I wanted to carry on my performance practice from the karaoke, but I was like, what's the most extreme form of karaoke? And I was like, oh, well, it's opera. So it's exactly the same, but I feel like with opera, obviously there's an infrastructure and a tradition around it that I really wanted to engage with, and thinking about that in relation to Black music and the history of jazz, gospel, blues, and how those things connect to classical music, which is very present in Black music and Black life, but much more in a spiritual context. So the story by Gwendolyn Brooks is basically a bunch of chapters that explore Maud's journey through life from being a child to a mother and wife, and it's her reflections and musings on her interiority and the world in the most simple, beautiful language. And I wrote an imaginary chapter that could go anywhere in the book, where Maud is singing to her soul about the things that she observes and what's going on in her life, and her soul is trying to tell her that she needs to learn how to rest, and in order to do that, she needs to practice breathing. And so I wrote the libretto with Victoria Adukwu-Bully, who's a poet and a writer, and then we worked with Joseph Howard on the score. And it wove in all of the different musical histories that I wanted it to. And the place we're in now is that we want to get funding to extend it so that it can be 70 to 80 minutes long, and we can have staging and costume and lighting, and we can take it to opera houses and festivals to tour, because performing it in the church was absolutely incredible, and it gave us a real sense of the potential for the work. And I think working collaboratively in this way was the most incredible experience. It was a definite transition from doing the karaoke, where I was leading a team creatively, and I performed a spoken word part, and I was writing, and I was really directing the whole process. And the thing that I most wanted to experience was a sense of alignment with everybody in terms of what we were doing and why. And so I was very clear that people could only really participate if they were willing to pour their emotional energy into the work, which is something very specific, I suppose, to art school people, but also particularly in the context of classical music, because that's not how they're trained, that they're trained to perform. So the idea of care was really important, especially because I was like, I'm trying to think about how to care for myself, and how Black women might care for themselves, and how we talk to ourselves or talk to each other, and how the world sees us. And so I think like there were certain ethics I had in terms of how I worked that were integral to the work being felt and communicated in the way that I wanted it to be. And like that is an ongoing process, and it's something that, yes, is like definitely different to working by myself in the studio in terms of the length of time it takes to do these things, how much money you need to do these things, and what it means to have so many different creative people contributing. But it's also really nourishing in a way, and I think it's impacted my painting practice quite a lot as well. So it's great to have both things.
Maybe very last question I'm going to ask you is your connection with Maud herself, because I mean the book is this sort of vignettes, but starts with this beautiful image of the protagonist is described as the 7 years old, like African American, who loves flowers. Because flowers proves that ordinary things can be beautiful.
Yes, because she's specifically looking at dandelions in her front garden, and obviously they're considered a weed. But I think like this sense that your view of the world can be really defined by a sense of curiosity, and also like magic in a way that isn't whimsical but really rooted in understanding like the spectacular nature of being alive. And if you connect to that and center your life around that, then things are both like wondrous and horrific at the same time. And like your job in life is just to try to, I suppose, work through those things. And like the cycles in life that she goes through, obviously they change, and she encounters like difficult things and like wonderful things, but at the core there's just this sense of her always wanting to think about her relationship to things being the way that she I suppose absorbs all of that in a kind of intentional and purposeful way. And like that's an incredible way to live, and she's doing that from the age of 7. And I think loads of people do have that way of engaging with the world, but don't have the space and time or the resources to cultivate it in the way that Maud seems to. But she does it in this very private and incredible way, and it reflects quite like a life of quietness without being, and it's like quietness isn't dormant, it's very active, but it's a slow and steady journey towards, I suppose, like enlightenment or like appreciation and celebration of just like whatever in life like fills you with joy.
Hopefully the year you have ahead of yourself.
Yes, indeed.
Shall we open to questions?
Yes,
before we go for drinks. Does anyone have a question?
Thank you. I was thinking about your series of paintings in San Francisco and wondering about how you know that they're finished, because you have a whole series, and then just saying about this work you're doing now that's taken maybe a whole year.
I have this really simple rule that something is finished if it's good enough. Like there's always something that can be done because of the way that I work, where I'm just layering lots of colours and adding things to, I suppose, like a coloured landscape. And so once things seem to hold themselves together and there's some cohesion and balance, then I'm like, okay, that's enough. And I think there has to be also like a feeling that I could do more, but I don't need to. So there's a letting go and an understanding that if I choose to, I can return to it and change it and maybe add or alter, but it's satisfying enough to leave that space for like, oh, what if, or something could be different. Like I think that's interesting because the paintings, because they're made up, there are always multiple endings or multiple versions of them. They're never fixed in like what they can be or what they should be, and so part of that means I have to understand that I decide when something is complete, and that resolves the work in a way where I can step away from it. But really, I could always go back to it and do something else. So there's never really an end point. It's just I choose to step away. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for all you've shared. I just happen to be the associate rector at St. James's Piccadilly as well.
Oh, wow!
So it was so wonderful for us to be able to welcome you there in 2023 and
thank you.
come back anytime you're here.
Yes, it was fabulous.
I have a question then about classicism and about architecture. I'm thinking about the Dulwich Picture Gallery, its heritage, its kind of reality as a built environment over the generations. Similarly, St. James's in the 17th century, Christopher Wren and its purpose, which is very different. So your anticipated work in the Courtauld is part of that Georgian legacy of 18th century British architecture, and that threshold space of interior-exterior is also striking me, at least, as a kind of a mouth, right? There's an entrance and there's an exit quality in terms of perhaps some of the things that you're curious about. So what do you think these kinds of classical architectural contexts and this idea of entrance, exit, mouth thresholds?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I always think about the experience people will have in those spaces when they're moving through them, because I understand like they impose such a strong sense of identity, and specifically, I suppose, in terms of who they were made by, who they were made for, who often frequents those spaces, And so I always create exhibitions with very site-specific work. So every show I make, I plan the entire layout of the show before I start making anything. And that's with regards to the size of the works and how many there will be. And I'll make more than necessary if I have the time, but there's always an idea of exactly the way I want to hang things, because I do think about the context of the space and the choreography of people moving through it and the different types of people that will move through it and what they'll be confronted with. And I never want to, I suppose, alienate anyone, and I think those spaces can be inherently complicated in them being quite, I don't know, imposing in a way, or uninviting. And like my work is interested in the complete opposite thing. And so I think colour, I use it as a tool in a way to feel like an invitation, but also like an assault on the buildings themselves. There are all these politics around colour, around culture, whiteness, like all of this stuff is very interesting, and I think about it, and it's quite, like it's very intentional that I work the way that I work, not just because I have like an emotional response to colour and it's very pleasurable and like it's something that I suppose set me up to relate to the world and myself in this way. It's also rooted in my cultural heritage and the way colour functions within, I suppose, like my heritage where I'm from, like Jamaica and Barbados, and the way colour is used spiritually, and how there is a complete lack of control in the way that colour, there is an absolute control, but also like a lack of control in like the way the paintings function in terms of colour. Like there is this disorder, and that is, I think, always in relation to the environment that it's in, and it's incredibly exciting to be able to do that and to make paintings for spaces like the Courtauld or Dulwich, because they function very differently to Chisenhale or like a project space like Harlesden High Street, where I didn't have paintings but I had images and they're from a contemporary context. And I just think like those sorts of things are really fun to work with, and I definitely feel like they complicate some of the ways people respond to the work, which is important because I think it means you have to engage with like the dual reality of, you know, the past and now at the same time, which you're always doing within yourself as well. Like you're always engaging with the you now and like the past. So it's like, it's the same with like histories and peoples collectively being together.
And I think it's very interesting how the first work that welcomes you and really takes you in has this energy, and the second one, which you sort of look at from a sort of this decking area out, there's much more this blue.
Yes.
So they you will see they will operate very differently. You know?
Yeah.
I was just interested in the role that music plays in your everyday life and in your own creative process, because you've talked about two pieces where you sort of formally engaged with it.
Yeah.
I wondered, like specifically when you're working on pieces that are involving sort of mouth and your own internal dialogue, do you listen to music when you're working, and how does that inform your own process?
Yes, yeah. I always listen to music in the studio, even when I have studio visits. Whenever Elena comes, there's always music in the background, and I listen to music. I would say probably the majority of my day, like on the way to work, on the way back, when I'm cooking. Like it's probably something that I didn't really, I suppose I'm like, everyone loves music, but I feel like I listen in a very specific way because I also played instruments as a child, and I went to music school for over 10 years. So I learned how to read music, and I played classical music and in orchestras and all this sort of stuff. And I find it interesting to listen to things that are, I suppose, maybe difficult, or things that I don't necessarily like, and then I want to learn how to appreciate them. So I don't always listen just for pleasure. It's much more as a way of understanding the stories that people are trying to tell, sonically and also lyrically. So I listen to literally every single genre of music. I don't use streaming services, I buy albums and I listen to them back to front repeatedly. I don't look at the track list, so I can never tell you the songs that I like by the name, but I know what number they are maybe, or like I'll just click through. So I have like a very particular way of listening to things, and it's about pleasure, but I'm very happy to be uncomfortable with what I listen to, because often you move through discomfort into like satisfaction, or at the very least appreciation or some sort of understanding. And then the idea of like repetitively listening to things, I think like that's important to develop a connection or like a relationship to things. And like the relationship to music most people have in the world today is very, it's a lot less rooted in like the consistency of building a connection to, I don't know, maybe like playing things not just because you like them, but because they've been made to give you an insight into someone's way of making or what someone wants to tell you. Like, do you know that Adele made her last album and you couldn't skip anything? It was like one whole thing. It's like that idea that like music is designed really to be received as a whole, not as just like a bunch of like individual moments or songs. And so I think that way of relating to sound is probably quite integral to maybe how I work as well, and the way I want people to respond to the work, or the way I try to think about creating a world around sound, and bringing people into that, but there being some tension. They can't just settle and relax, like there is some activation that is happening. Yeah, I think like that's probably like a big part. And I buy CDs. I have a CD player at home, so like I have like a pretty like random way of finding things, but I feel like it's part of the pleasure of like discovery and a bit of like difficulty in like how I hear things. I don't know, I just find it rewarding. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. I think you mentioned somewhere in your presentation, or in your conversation, that you went through a period of not enjoying your artistic production and just being really unhappy with what was coming out. So I wonder, how do you sit with that and interrogate as an artist when your livelihood is artistic production?
Yes.
And how do you move forward?
Yeah, oh, that's a really good question. I think that's an inherent part of making anything, no matter what it is. Like there are periods of times where you don't necessarily know how to reach for the thing you're trying to get to. And you really have to learn how to get good at waiting for that to shift and change. And the only way that happens is by being consistent. I think that's where something regarding labour becomes really important, and thinking about being an artist as obviously a very creative and I think like spiritual endeavour, but it is as much as anything else like a job, and like the idea of commitment and like doing something doing something with the intention that no matter how challenging it might be, there is an intention and purpose that means your commitment will basically push you through whatever like hurdle you are kind of like struggling with. And for me, it has meant reflecting on like what it is that maybe is preventing me from getting where I want to in the work, what is happening in my life outside of the studio, and not separating what happens in the studio from like who I am as a person and what's going on in the world, because those things really come with you into the space when you're working, certainly in the way that I work. And then thinking about, well, like how do I maybe provide myself with things that might help me. So when I'm struggling, often I stop painting, and I've not had the luxury of doing that in the past few years because I've been doing so many shows back to back, but I take time off all the time whenever I can, and I think a reset for my brain is really important, because the works are very mentally and physically draining to make, and there's so much that's happening in them that sometimes I've learned that over time I need to purge myself of like all of the things that I've maybe been surrounding myself with visually, so that I can get back to an equilibrium. And that's sort of like where, and then I might make work to help me figure out what that means. So sometimes, or it might come into the work, sometimes when there are like areas of just like block color in a painting, like that's a moment for my eyes to rest. And it's like, I find ways of giving myself some sort of reprieve whilst I'm making. Like sometimes when I'm very tired, but I have to make paintings, I'll think about how can you make this work with the least amount of energy, and then that inherently will develop some of the visual language because I'm trying to make the work without using as much mark making. And so I find ways of practically trying to look after myself or like getting over certain humps. But then I also think in terms of the longevity of my practice, and knowing that I'm always going to encounter times that are difficult, and I try to structure space around myself so that I can do that in a way without pressure, because that's what makes it really difficult. When you're failing but you have pressure to succeed, that's what makes it horrible. Failure in and of itself is actually very important, and it's an inherent part of making things. It's how you progress, it's how you learn. So I relish that, but it's difficult to feel able to engage with that when you know that there is a deadline or there's something that people are expecting to see. And so that's kind of why I'm having my year off. I planned it 2 years ago, and this was the first time I actually got to have it. And I'm going to take myself back to a place of really being able to just experience life without thinking about making stuff. And also like being able to make things without it going anywhere and about any expectation of what it is that I'm making. And I'm quite excited about doing things that I haven't done before and being bad at it. Like that's, I think, great. So yeah, I do feel like I've kind of figured out some of how to get around that, but it is still really difficult. Yeah, it's like an ongoing thing.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been such a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.